It was the kind of darkness that swallowed entire ships. A North Atlantic night in November, 1943. The wind screamed at 50 knots, whipping the sea into a chaos of 40-foot walls of black water. On the bridge of the USS Bowery, a destroyer so old its crew called it a tin can, Lieutenant Charles Hutchins stared at a single glowing blip on the radar screen. 8,000 yards out. A ghost in the storm. His orders were simple: find and kill the U-boat terrorizing Allied convoy routes. But this wasn't just any submarine. This was U-405, a veteran hunter with 5 merchant kills to its name, commanded by a hardened ace. The Bowery, by contrast, was built in 1920. Most of her crew had never seen combat. Hutchins himself had been a salesman just 2 years before. The radar operator called out the closing distance. 3,000 yards. 2,000. Then the blip vanished into the sea clutter. They'd lost it. The U-boat was going deep. Hutchins had one shot. He gave the order to attack with depth charges. What happened next wasn't an attack. It was a catastrophic accident. A mechanical failure released every single depth charge on one side of the ship at once. The ocean erupted in a single, convulsive explosion. The concussion wave hammered the Bowery's hull. And then the sea itself seemed to vomit the enemy back to the surface. In the Bowery's searchlight beam, the German submarine U-405 broke the waves, damaged and unable to dive. She was 400 yards away. And in that frozen moment, both captains knew the same terrifying truth. There would be no elegant torpedo duel, no long-range gunnery. The storm had seen to that. This was going to be a knife fight. At point-blank range. In a rolling, pitch-black arena where one mistake meant drowning. The crews of both ships scrambled as the first shots were fired. But Hutchins and the German commander, Captain Lieutenant Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, were about to make decisions that would defy all naval doctrine. Decisions that would lead their crews into a close-quarters battle so intimate, so savage, it would be etched into the nightmares of every survivor. Because in less than a minute, these two vessels wouldn't just be fighting side by side. They would become locked together in a metallic embrace. The Bowery would literally sit on top of the U-boat. And for 10 endless minutes, the war would stop being about ships and torpedoes. It would become a primal face-to-face brawl in the middle of the ocean, fought with rifles, knives, and bare hands. The searchlight was a death sentence. It pinned the U-405 in a cone of blinding white, every detail horrifyingly clear to the American sailors. Men in dark leather jackets poured from the submarine's conning tower like angry ants, scrambling towards their deck guns. The Bowery's 4-inch guns roared first. Shells tore across the water. But the German crew were veterans. They didn't panic. They ran through the geysers of spray, manning their own brutal arsenal, an 88mm deck gun and 4 twin-mounted 20mm autocannons. At this range, those rapid-fire cannons could shred the Bowery's superstructure, killing every man on her bridge and decks in seconds. The first 20mm bursts found their mark. Tracer fire, glowing and lethal, stitched a line across the Bowery's hull near the forward engine room. Metal screamed. The Bowery's gunners answered, their shells walking across the U-boat's deck. They caught the German gun crews in the open. The 88mm cannon never fired a single shot. But Captain Lieutenant Hauptmann was no fool. He had 7 war patrols under his belt. He knew his submarine's one advantage: agility. While the Bowery was a 1,200-ton destroyer, the U-405 could turn on a mark. Hauptmann threw his helm over, putting the sub into a tight, desperate circle. For 20 frantic minutes, it became a deadly dance. The Bowery tried to line up a broadside, but the U-boat's tighter turning radius kept its stern, and its loaded stern torpedo tube, constantly pointed at the destroyer. That one torpedo was a sword hanging over Hutchins' head. A single hit would break the Bowery in half. Hutchins stood on the bridge, the wind and salt spray whipping at his face. He could see the German commander through his binoculars, a dark figure in the sub's coming tower. He was being outmaneuvered. His older, larger ship couldn't win this turning fight. The storm and the clever German captain were conspiring against him. He had to change the game. He had to remove that torpedo threat. Now, a radical, almost unthinkable idea crystallized in his mind. It was a tactic from the age of sail, not modern warfare. It violated every page of the naval handbook. But the handbook hadn't been written for a storm-tossed brawl against a cornered wolf. He called down to the engine room. All ahead flank. He gripped the brass rail of the bridge. His voice when he gave the next order was calm, absolute. It echoed in the wheelhouse, leaving his officers stunned. Helm, prepare to ram. Aim for her starboard quarter. We're going to cut her in half. He was going to use his 1,200-ton destroyer as a battering ram. It was a move of sheer brutal desperation. But as the Boreas' engines surged, building to 25 knots, and the damaged U-boat grew larger in the searchlight, a monstrous wave rose between them. A towering black wall of North Atlantic water. It lifted the Boreas' bow high into the air, and changed everything. The collision wouldn't be a clean, hull-crushing impact. It would be something far more bizarre, far more terrifying, and it would trap both crews in a nightmare neither side could have ever drilled for. The world tilted. The massive swell lifted the Boreas' bow like a seesaw, suspending thousands of tons of steel in the air before gravity took over. Hutchins watched, helpless, as his plan disintegrated. He wasn't aiming for the U-boat's hull anymore. He was falling onto it. The destroyer's bow didn't slice into the submarine's side. It crashed down on top of it just behind the conning tower. There was a deafening, metallic shriek that drowned out the storm, the sound of two warships being forced into a single, grotesque entity. The impact threw men from their feet. The Boreas jerked to a sudden, shuddering stop, perched at a 20-degree angle. She wasn't riding beside the U-boat. She was straddling it. Her bow rested on the submarine's forward deck, her keel grinding against the pressure hull. The two vessels were locked in a deadly, intimate embrace, rising and falling together with the colossal swells. On the bridge, Hutchins looked down. The view was surreal. He could see the painted numbers on the U-405's conning tower, just 30 feet below. He could see the frightened face of a German sailor staring back up at him. The submarine's deck was now an extension of his own ship, bathed in the unflinching glare of the searchlight. And on that deck the German crew was recovering. They saw their chance. The 4 20mm autocannon mounts were still intact. If they could reach them, they could sweep the Boreas' exposed decks clean. It would be a slaughter. A German officer emerged from the conning tower hatch, pointing frantically at the nearest gun mount. Men began to clamber out, their weapons forgotten. They just needed to run a few meters. But Lieutenant Hutchins' executive officer, a man named Philip Brown, had a peculiar obsession. 4 months, against all logic, he had drilled the crew in ancient, almost forgotten tactics. Boarding party actions and close-quarters defense. The men had laughed about it. What use was a rifle against a torpedo? Now they understood. As the first German sailor's foot hit the deck, Brown's voice boomed over the ship's intercom, cool and clear. All hands, deck defense, repel boarders. What happened next wasn't a naval battle. It was a riot, a melee. The Boreas' crew erupted from hatches and companionways. They weren't carrying shells. They carried Thompson submachine guns, shotguns, M1 rifles, and 1911 pistols. A signalman raised a very flare pistol, not to signal but to fire as a weapon. The searchlight, their curse, became their salvation. Every German who climbed into the light was perfectly silhouetted. The night erupted with the staccato crack of small arms fire. American sailors lined the rails, firing down at point-blank range. The first Germans fell before they took 3 steps. But they kept coming. They had to. Those guns were their only hope. The battle had devolved into something raw and personal. This was no longer about sinking a ship. It was about surviving the next 10 minutes. And on the locked-together decks below, a young American fireman, out of ammunition, would make a decision that turned this naval engagement into a legend of sheer, brutal will. Fireman First Class David Southwick felt the panic rise in his throat like bile. He'd emptied his rifle clip at the shapes moving in the searchlight below. He fumbled for another, his numb fingers slipping on the cold metal. Empty. He was out. All around him, the deafening cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the ungodly groan of metal grinding on metal. Then he saw him. A German sailor, young and desperate, had broken from the cover of the conning tower. He wasn't heading for the big guns. He was sprinting for one of the 20mm autocannons, its twin barrels promising annihilation for the Americans above. In seconds he'd be there. Southwick had no gun, no bullet. He was a mechanic, not an infantryman. His eyes darted across the deck looking for anything, a wrench, a piece of pipe. Nothing. His hand went to his belt. His fingers closed around the leather-wrapped handle of his standard-issue sheath knife. It was a tool for cutting rope, opening crates. It was not a weapon for a naval battle. He didn't think. He acted. Pulling the knife free, he leaned over the rail, took aim at the sprinting figure 30 feet below, and threw. It was not a graceful throw. It was a frantic, overhand hurl. The blade tumbled through the beam of the searchlight, a brief flash of steel. It struck the German sailor in the lower back. The man's sprint faltered. He stumbled, arched backward with a cry lost in the noise, and then toppled over the side, disappearing into the churning black water between the two hulls. Southwick stared, stunned at what he'd just done. He felt no triumph, only a hollow shock. This was the reality of their situation. They were fighting not with complex machinery but with whatever was at hand. And they weren't alone in their desperation. Across the deck, Chief Boatswain's Mate Walter Cruz, in charge of a now useless 4-inch gun that couldn't depress low enough to fire, saw another German lunging for a gun mount. Enraged, Cruz grabbed the only thing within reach, a spent 4-foot-long brass shell casing from his own gun. It weighed over 30 pounds. He hoisted it like a club, roared, and hurled it over the side. The heavy casing sailed down and caught the German square in the chest with a sickening thud, knocking him clean overboard. The battle had descended into pure, primal chaos. A signalman fired a very flare. The burning phosphorus projectile struck a man in the chest, the chemical fire eating through his jacket. A cook threw a coffee pot. It was madness, but it was working. The German assault faltered. They couldn't cross that lethally illuminated killing zone. Yet, from the safety of their hatches, they kept up a sporadic, peppering fire of their own. Bullets spanged off the Bory's superstructure. The two crews were locked in a stalemate of grinding metal and flying lead. And below decks, in the forward engine room, freezing seawater was rising fast. The grinding hulls had open seams. The Bory was taking on water, and the pumps couldn't keep up. Time, which felt frozen during the fight, was now their most relentless enemy. They had to break free. But separating might be the most dangerous move of all. The sound was the worst part. A deep, tortured groaning of steel, a shriek of torn metal that vibrated through the decks and into the bones of every man aboard the Bory. It was the sound of the ship dying. With each titanic lift and drop of the swells, the destroyer's weight was slowly crushing the submarine beneath it, and in turn the submarine's hardened back was tearing the destroyer's softer belly open. In the forward engine room, the situation shifted from critical to catastrophic. Seawater, black and icy, wasn't just seeping in anymore, it was pouring through a ruptured seam. The pumps, whining at their maximum capacity, were fighting a losing battle. The waterline crept up, swallowing machinery, drowning the boilers. The space filled with the roar of inrushing ocean and the shouts of men desperately trying to shore up the breach with blankets and mattresses. It was futile. On the bridge, the reports piled up, each one worse than the last. Forward engine room flooding, sir. Portside hull breached below the waterline. Steering is sluggish. Lieutenant Hutchins absorbed each piece of information, his face a mask. The small arms battle on the decks was a stalemate, but the structural battle was one they were losing. Every second locked together was a second closer to the point of no return. Then, with a final apocalyptic screech that silenced the gunfire, the tortured metal gave way. It wasn't a clean break. It was a reluctant, grinding separation. The Bory's bow, with a sound like a giant zipper tearing, began to slide off the submarine's deck. An inch. A foot. The angle lessened. The two vessels, after 10 nightmarish minutes as a single entity, were being pried apart by the very sea that had joined them. A wave larger than the others surged between them. It was the final push. The Bory lurched free, stumbling back into the water like a boxer breaking from a clinch. 50 yards of churning, debris-strewn ocean now lay between the two wounded beasts. The silence that followed was almost more shocking than the noise. For a moment, there was only the howl of the wind and the crash of waves. The searchlight, still blazing, held the U-405 in its beam. The submarine wallowed, low in the water, its deck scarred and littered, but its conning tower still standing. It was hurt, but it was not dead. And Captain Lieutenant Hauptmann proved it instantly. The submarine's propellers churned the water to foam. Instead of trying to flee, the U-405 used its agility once more, turning with a purpose that chilled the Americans watching. It presented its stern to the Bory. That single, loaded stern torpedo tube was now pointed directly at them. The sword was still hanging. And the German commander, backed into a corner, bleeding but unbowed, was preparing to use it. The knife fight was over. Now it was a duel. And Hutchins had a flooding, listing ship against a submarine that still had one lethal trick left. The standoff was silent, tense, and absolute. 50 yards of heaving black water separated them. In the searchlight's beam, the U-405's stern torpedo tube looked like a single, unblinking eye. Every American sailor on the Bory's deck knew what it meant. At this range, a torpedo couldn't miss. It was a checkmate move. Lieutenant Hutchins' mind raced. His ship was crippled. A straight pursuit was impossible. The U-boat's tighter turn radius would keep that deadly stern tube on him forever. He couldn't charge. He couldn't run. He had to be smarter than the veteran across the water. He made a dangerous gamble. "Extinguish the searchlight," he ordered. The brilliant beam died, plunging the submarine into utter darkness. To Captain Lieutenant Hauptmann, it would look like the Americans had lost him or were retreating. It was an invitation. An illusion of escape. Radar screen shows moving blip. On the Boris Bridge, they watched the faint green glow of the radar screen. The blip began to move, gathering speed. The U-boat was taking the bait. It was turning, not to keep its stern to them, but to put its broadside to the wind and run. It was the moment Hutchins had waited for. "Searchlight, on. All engines ahead, flank. Bring us about, hard to starboard. Gunnery, target the conning tower and pressure hull." Light and noise erupted simultaneously. The searchlight snapped back on, catching the U-405 in the act of flight. The Bory, groaning in protest, heaved itself into a turn. For the first time since the ramming, Hutchins could bring his full broadside of 4-inch guns and his depth-charge projectors to bear. The guns barked, shells walking across the short distance and slamming into the submarine's hull. One struck near the base of the conning tower. Another hit the pressure hull with a dull, ominous crump. A third found the diesel exhaust, and thick, black smoke began to pour from the submarine. Her engine died. The run was over. But Hauptmann was not finished. He was a cornered wolf. As the Bory closed in for the kill, the wounded submarine did something unbelievable. It turned again, not away but toward the destroyer. Its bow aimed directly for the Bory's midships. He was going to ram. A final, mutual death. Hutchins saw it coming. He didn't flinch. Hard left rudder. Back full on the port engine. He wasn't trying to avoid the collision. He was engineering it on his own terms. The Bory's stern kicked violently to the right, swinging toward the oncoming submarine. The range closed to an absurd 20 feet, then 10. The U-boat's bow was aimed at empty water where the destroyer's side had been. Instead, the Bory's stern presented itself. And from that stern, Hutchins fired his last point-blank weapon. Fire depth charges. Shallow setting. 3 depth charges tumbled from their projectors, hitting the water not 6 feet from the U-405's conning tower. They were set to explode at just 30 feet. The sequence was merciless. The splash, a heartbeat of silence, and then. The underwater detonations were not loud booms, but massive, subterranean thumps that shoved the ocean itself aside. The water between the ships erupted in a single, boiling column. The shock wave hit the submarine like a giant's fist. It stopped dead in the water, broken. The duel was over. But as the geyser of water fell back into the sea, revealing a listing, smoking U-405, Hutchins saw a new danger. The submarine's stern was now just yards from his own side. And that torpedo tube was still there. One last, dying twitch from a mortally wounded beast could still kill them all. The two ships drifted, locked in a new, deadly proximity. 6 feet of churning, frothing water was all that separated the Bory's starboard side from the U-405's stern. In the searchlight, the submarine's torpedo tube was a yawning black hole pointed directly at the destroyer's vitals. On the German submarine, chaos reigned. The depth charge blast had shattered internal systems. Lights were out. The engine was dead. Seawater was rushing in. But in the control room, Captain Lieutenant Hauptmann, bleeding from a head wound, faced a final, brutal calculation. His boat was finished. She was going down. But he still had one torpedo. One chance to take his killer with him. He gave the order. Stern tube. Fewer. A hiss of compressed air, a bubble of white foam, and the G7E torpedo shot from its tube. It entered the water a mere 6 feet from the Bory's hull. At that range, the weapon's internal gyroscopes, designed to steer it over hundreds of yards, had no time to stabilize. The torpedo porpoised. It broke the surface, dove, then broke the surface again in a wide, relieved shot from the Bory's deck. The torpedo passes harmlessly down the side of the ship, its wake visible in the searchlight, before disappearing into the darkness. The U-405 begins its final plunge. A wide, somber shot as the submarine, stern first, slips beneath the black waves, leaving behind a swirl of debris and oil. A tight, emotional close-up of a young American sailor watching the U-boat sink, his face showing not triumph, but exhaustion and profound relief. A wide, grim shot of the heavily damaged USS Bory, listing badly, alone in the raging dawn sea. The storm is beginning to lighten. An interior shot showing the severe list of the ship, men bracing themselves in passageways, water sloshing on the decks. A heroic backlit dawn shot. The crew works tirelessly on deck, jettisoning heavy equipment and setting up emergency pumps to save their ship. A final, wide shot at dawn. The doomed USS Bowery, low in the water and abandoned, slips beneath the waves of the North Atlantic as survivors watch from life rafts. A close-up of Lieutenant Hutchins in a life raft, wrapped in a blanket, looking back at where his ship went down, his face etched with loss and resolve. A shot from a life raft, looking at other rafts filled with exhausted, shivering survivors in the vast, empty ocean at dawn. A rescue shot. A friendly destroyer arrives on the horizon, its silhouette cutting through the morning mist, a symbol of hope. A final, poignant archival-style portrait. A grainy, close-up photo of crewmen from the USS Bowery, their faces showing the wear of battle, a solemn reminder of the engagement.